Welcome to the second video in the Matters of Fate playlist, where I'm going to be taking a little bit more of a look at the process of creating a game in Fate first of all, and drilling down in a bit more detail into some of the concepts in Fate, and later on talking about how you can do things to improve your own games. Now, first things first, in this video we're going to talk about creating a setting in Fate. Before we get started though, you'll need somewhere to write down your notes as we go along, and there are various worksheets available to do this. I'll talk about some of those later. But to be perfectly honest, there's nothing wrong with a lined pad or whatever writing method you prefer, whether that be a notepad, file or whatever. Personally, I tend to use a pack of these index cards, easily available from any stationery store, very cheap, and writing down individual elements on their own separate cards allows you to shuffle things around and make room for new entries later on. And also I normally write them in a permanent marker. I normally have a few colours knocking around, so if I need to highlight something or make it stand out from the rest of the passage that I'm writing, then I can just pick a different colour and just carry on writing. And that's just personal preference. Those are what I find easiest to use. Use whatever you find easiest for noting down your notes, as long as it's making your task more straightforward and not getting in the way of recording the information. Now, in a Fate game, the players really are the stars of the show, and we come back to that sort of holy trinity that we mentioned in the intro video, and I'll put a link to that if you want to watch that, where you can click on the playlist. And that trinity is proactivity, competence and drama, all three things which are required to make a really good Fate game. And all of these concepts connect back to the characters. Your first step as a GM contemplating running a Fate game should be to decide what sort of people the main protagonists of your game, i.e. the player characters, are and what sort of world they live in. We're going to go into more detail about creating a Fate character in the next video. For now though, sit down with your players and just get a general idea of what sort of characters they are looking to play and what world they exist in. A few examples off the top of my head are hard-bitten detectives in Prohibition America, everyday people trying to defend the world against an invasion of alien body snatchers, or one I've actually used myself, a salty pirate crew seeking treasure on the 17th century seas. Now, over the course of this video, I'm going to be looking at the example of the hard-bitten detectives in Prohibition America and using that as an example to show you the sort of things that you can do to create your settings. Now, once you've got a rough idea of what sort of characters your players want to play, then it should give you some ideas about the setting anyway. For example, we know that our pirate crew are likely to inhabit a world of competing colonial powers, battles on the high seas and buried treasure, whereas the detectives are likely to be living in a grey world of paranoia, gang crime and depression era economics. If your setting is the real world or is loosely based on it, or you're using a setting that already exists in a movie or a novel, then you already have a very valuable source of background information, and you just need to define, working together with your players, where your version of the game world differs from the real or fictional world that you are basing it on. One source of information I find very useful for real world inspiration are tourist guides. They contain maps and a lot of useful information that is normally presented in an easy to understand format, whilst being general enough that it's easy to put your own spin on things. Personally, I've got a number of the eyewitness guides for cities in America, and I've found them invaluable when I've ran various World of Darkness games set in a bleak version of our own world and other sort of real world based games. If you're running a game in a historical period, then in addition to history books, I've also found the various GURPS historical supplements to be extremely well written, not very expensive, and they're presented in a way that's very accessible to gamers since they are game supplements. Now, creating an entire campaign world from scratch is a vast and expansive topic that is covered in great detail on the net in a multitude of videos, some of which I've done myself, and via various YouTubers and blogs. It's a topic that's beyond the scope of this single video. However, there are a few things worth keeping in mind whilst creating a world from scratch in Fate. 1. Don't try and detail everything at the start. 2. Be sure to get your players' input on the world. 3. Get your players involved in the creation of the world so that they feel invested in it. 4. Detail out those factors that most immediately impact the PCs and lightly sketch in other details. This way you have enough info to run with if the player characters do something unexpected, and also you can fill in further details as they become necessary. So for our example world, I'm going to set our hard-bitten detective story in the fictional city of Capital City, taking inspiration from one of my favourite cartoons, The Simpsons. And the city is referred to in The Simpsons as the Windy Apple, and it's sort of an amalgamation between Chicago, New York and other various big American cities. By doing this, it frees me up to take select bits that I want from various different real world inspirations, but also frees me of having to adhere to anything too dedicated to the real world, which I think, since most people will be familiar with the sort of noir detective style genre, then it's not too much of a push to ask players to buy into that. The next thing we need to do is we need to decide on the scale or scope of our story, and by this I mean whether the players are going to deal with epic storylines such as saving a kingdom or an entire people, or whether the issues are more local in scope, perhaps freeing a local city block from the grip of ruthless drug dealers or tracking down a kidnap victim. In general, a more local scale game takes place in a smaller area, and so requires that that area be covered in a little more detail. After all, if the players have all their stories taking place in a single city block or street, then after a while, players will expect to become familiar with notable NPCs, locations, shops, etc. If you prepare at least these main details in advance, then it goes a long way towards creating the consistency of setting that is very important towards giving a campaign a sort of feeling of internal realism. Wider or more epically scaled games tend to involve more travelling about and are rather more concerned with great deeds and the sweeping arcs of plot rather than which greengrocer's having an affair with one of his customers, who had their car stolen the other day, etc, etc. Those are more local issues. With this sort of game, it's more important, in my opinion, to emphasise the overall character of specific areas and the difference between different locations, so that when the players travel to a foreign city, it feels noticeably different and actually like they have travelled to foreign climes. So for our example, we're going to go for a local scale game which takes place on the same city block in Capital City. The next thing to do is to decide on the main issues within a setting. Now, most RPGs focus around some sort of conflict or impediment to the characters achieving their goals. I mean, after all, if it was dead easy to just walk in and get the treasure, free the princess, whatever you're doing, without any opposition, then there wouldn't really be a lot of point playing. It's often the opposition that really brings the interest home in RPGs, whether this be the naval admiral hunting your pirate ship, seeking to recover the treasure that was stolen from the Spanish Navy, or the leg-breaking gangsters who don't like the detectives poking around in their business. Now, there's a handy sheet available on the Evil Hat website to help you note down the various factors of a game, and I'll put a link to that down below. There are two types of issues that the Fate core book recommends, and these are current issues, which are problems or complications that are occurring right now in the campaign world or that have existed for some time. And there are impending issues, and these are things which have only just started to rear their heads and threaten to change the setting in a negative way, at least generally as far as the player characters are concerned. Now, you can have any number of issues in your campaign. However, the Fate core book recommends 2 issues in total. You could go for 2 current issues where you'd probably end up with a game that's solely about trying to make the world a better place. You could have 2 impending issues when it's all about trying to save people and places from threats that are upcoming. Or you could go for a mixture of the 2, having 1 current and 1 impending. And I find this is a good mix, so I tend to go for 1 of each. So for our example game, I picked one of each issue, which are, we have the current issue, the Falcone family control the streets, a crime family or syndicate that has a vice-like grip on the city, and the impending issue, one of our informants has information that can bring the Falcones down, but only if we get to him first. And this is obviously something the players will have only just found out at the start of the game, but it's something they can immediately jump straight into and get involved in. Now, once you've created your issues, you have to turn them into aspects. And we'll talk a bit more about aspects later. But essentially, aspects are story tags that can be invoked by players at the cost of 1 fate point to gain various bonuses, or that can be compelled by either the GM or other players by offering the compelled player a fate point, and to introduce additional complications into the PC's life. By accepting the complication as proposed, the player is rewarded by getting a fate point. And as I say, I'll cover them in more detail later on in the series, but for now you basically need to write down a little sentence about each of your issues which really sums them up. And as I say, for our examples, we have that the Falcone family controls the streets, and that one of our informants has information that can bring the Falcones down, but we've got to get to him first. If you're not sure about this step, come back to it once the characters have been created, since character creation also involves aspects and it'll give you a little bit more practice at creating them. The next step is faces, places and organisations. Now, for each of your issues and for any other major elements of your setting, create a person, a place or an organisation, and you should do at least one for each of your main elements of your setting, although you can do more if you wish, and then write down a single sentence description for them, and this description will become an aspect later. For example, in our Prohibition detective story, we might have the building that the PC's detectives work from, and the sentence I wrote down for that is, it might be a wreck but it's home. We also have their secretary, sure she talks too much but the customers love her. Moving on to aspects and elements of the game linked with our issues, we have Don Carmine Falcone linked with our current issue, and I describe him as a merciless, ruthless man who lets no one stand in his way. On a slightly more general note, but still connected with the current issue, we have the Falcone family, a criminal family who all but run the city. And last but not least, we have our informant, who I've named Greasy Joe, and I've wrote down for him the description of, yes, he's a rat, but he normally comes through for us. And that's all you really need to write at this stage. It's just enough to give you a general idea and enough to spur your roleplay on. So you can always fill in more details later. Now, if an element of the setting is supposed to be a mystery, then define it loosely so that more details can be discovered later. For example, if I was going to define the important news that our informant has, then I might do it like this. And I've just got an index card here that says Greasy Joe's information, something major that can bring down the Falcone family. So I've not actually defined what the information is there, but only the fact that it exists. And later on, when the players discover what that information is, assuming it is, I can easily just write down on the other side of the card or below what I've currently written what that information is to add on the extra details. If, when you get to this point, your players are all fired up and they want to create their characters, then go ahead and do so. Otherwise, feel free to keep discussing the campaign world and defining elements for as long as you feel it's necessary. Just remember not to 100% lock down everything, otherwise you'll have no room to add in additional stuff later on. So, to summarise, when you're creating your campaign setting, first of all, sit down with your players and get a general idea of what sort of characters and what sort of world that they want to play in. Once you've got this rough idea, decide on the scale or scope of your story. Is it going to be an epic scale story of heroism and mythic adventure, or is it going to be more localised in scope? Next, decide on the main issues of your setting, whether they are current issues, which are issues that currently exist in the setting or are happening now, or whether they're impending issues, threats that have only just started to rear their head, and pick a number of them. Fate Core recommends 2, but you can have any combination of current or impending issues. Once you've created your issues, turn them into aspects. Write down a little sentence summing them up. Next, for each of your main elements, create either a person, a place, or an organisation that goes with them, and write those down on a card along with a small sentence summing them up, which later on will turn into an aspect. And remember, if an element of your setting is supposed to be a mystery, define it very generally and then later on add in more details once the mystery is solved. And once you reach that point, if your players want to create their characters, go ahead and create the characters. You can always come back to this. Otherwise, keep going back and forth between you and the players, creating new elements and aspects for your game order for as long as you feel it's necessary. Just remember, don't set everything too firmly and lock it down at this stage. So you want room to expand and be creative later on. So there we go, that's a brief video talking about how you can create a setting in Fate. Remember that there is a setting creation sheet on the Evil Hat Productions website, and I'll put a link to that in the comments down below. I hope you've enjoyed this video. You consider giving it a thumbs up and clicking on the red dice up there to subscribe. If you have any questions, please either put them in the comments box down below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. As always, I really do enjoy reading what you write. And in our next video in this series, we'll be talking about how to create characters in Fate. So I hope to see you there.